A male heir is the absolute foundation of this dukedom, Eleanor. Victoria carries my son. Leave my lands immediately.
Julian, you thought my family was poor. You didn't realize you just banished the true owner of the largest fortune in the Empire. Your dukedom is bankrupt, Julian. Now, crawl to my feet and beg for your miserable life.
Because I bore him 3 daughters, Duke Julian cast us out into a freezing midnight storm, replacing me with his pregnant mistress. He thought he was abandoning a helpless woman with nothing, but he never knew that my family secretly owns the Continental Trust, the largest fortune in the Empire. Overnight, I froze his accounts, bankrupting his entire dukedom and forcing him to beg for scraps. Now, as he crawls in the mud, ruined and broken, the Crown Prince himself is kneeling at my feet, offering me the throne. Duke Julian, your living nightmare has just begun. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The heavy iron gates of Sterling Manor slammed shut, severing me from the life I had known. Cold rain soaked through my velvet dress, clinging to my shivering frame. I held my youngest daughter tightly against my chest to shield her from the biting wind. Beside me stood my other 2 little girls, their small hands gripping my damp skirts in terrified silence. 3 daughters. That was my unforgivable crime in the eyes of Duke Julian. Through the wrought iron bars, I could see the warm golden glow of the estate windows. Julian stood in the grand foyer, his arm wrapped possessively around Victoria. Victoria's hand rested purposefully on her visibly swollen belly. She wore my family's priceless sapphire necklace around her pale throat. A male heir is the absolute foundation of this dukedom, Julian had declared just an hour ago. His voice had been as cold as the marble floor beneath my knees. You have failed your sole duty as a duchess, Eleanor. I had stared up at the man I had devoted my youth to. His eyes held no pity, only a chilling indifference. Victoria carries my son, he had announced, pulling the smirking woman into my private drawing room. Pack your meager belongings and leave my lands immediately. He did not even look at the 3 innocent children trembling behind me. They were his own flesh and blood, yet he discarded them like worthless ashes. Now, we stood abandoned in the dark, stripped of our titles and our security. Victoria's mocking laugh drifted through the courtyard, cutting through the rhythmic sound of the rain. She believed she had won everything. She believed she had broken me completely. But as I looked down at the trusting eyes of my 3 girls, a fierce determination ignited within my chest. My tears suddenly stopped falling. The desperate, pleading wife died forever on those muddy cobblestones. In her place, an untouchable mother awoke. I traced the hidden brass key concealed deep within my cloak pocket. It was the only key to my late grandfather's secret banking vault in the capital. Julian always thought my maternal family were poor, uneducated provincial merchants. He never bothered to learn that my grandfather was the quiet, shadowy financial backer of the royal crown. He thought he was casting out a weak, useless woman with absolutely no resources. He did not realize he had just banished the true owner of the region's largest fortune. I wiped the rain from my eldest daughter's face and offered her a serene, confident smile. Do not look back at that house, my sweet girls, I whispered into the howling night. Tomorrow, we begin building an empire of our own. The stormy night eventually gave way to a cold, grey dawn. I used the last silver coin in my pocket to hire a modest carriage. My 3 exhausted daughters slept huddled together on the worn leather seats. We traveled far away from the oppressive shadow of Sterling Manor. Our destination was the bustling, wealthy heart of the royal capital. I directed the driver to the towering iron doors of the Continental Trust. It was the most prestigious and highly guarded financial institution in the empire. Julian always sneered at the common merchants who managed this powerful bank. He foolishly believed aristocratic blood was naturally superior to earned wealth. He was a highly arrogant man who never understood how the modern world truly functioned. I walked into the opulent marble lobby carrying my youngest child. My damp dress and messy hair immediately drew disgusted looks from the wealthy patrons. A senior bank clerk approached me with a highly condescending frown on his face. "This establishment is strictly reserved for elite account holders, madam," he stated sharply. I did not waste a single second arguing with the arrogant employee. I simply placed the heavy brass key onto his polished mahogany desk. The clerk's smug face drained of all color the second he saw the unique engraving. He instantly recognized the hidden crest of the bank's shadowy founding patron. Within 60 seconds, the bank president was running frantically down the grand marble stairs. The powerful financial executive practically fell to his knees in front of me. "My lady, we have been waiting for the true heir for 5 long years," he whispered respectfully. In that exact moment, my grandfather's legendary, unfathomable fortune became mine to command. I was instantly the absolute wealthiest private citizen in the entire kingdom. Back at Stirling Manor, Julian was experiencing a very different kind of morning. He had ordered a lavish breakfast to celebrate Victoria's newly elevated position. Victoria was busy ordering ridiculously expensive imported silks for her upcoming maternity gowns. Their arrogant celebration was abruptly interrupted by the estate's terrified chief accountant. The old man burst into the dining room waving a stack of urgent financial documents. "Your Grace, the central bank has completely frozen all of our active accounts," the accountant stammered. Julian dropped his solid silver fork, his face twisting into an ugly mask of confusion. "What exactly do you mean frozen?" the Duke roared aggressively at his elderly servant. "The Duchess Eleanor's family trusts have been legally and entirely withdrawn from our treasury," the accountant explained. Julian had completely forgotten that my quiet dowry secretly funded his luxurious, wasteful lifestyle for years. Without my hidden money, the magnificent Sterling dukedom was essentially bankrupt overnight. He had ruthlessly thrown out his loyal wife solely to secure a male heir. He did not realize he had just thrown away the absolute financial foundation of his entire existence. I purchased a highly secure, modern townhouse in the capital's most exclusive district. My daughters were finally safe behind heavy steel doors and armed private security. I did not waste a single second resting in my luxurious new home. I officially took the highest seat in the executive boardroom of the Continental Trust. The empire's most ruthless businessmen quickly learned to fear and respect my name. Meanwhile, Julian's financial situation had deteriorated into an absolute disaster. The local merchants had completely cut off all supply lines to Stirling Manor. Victoria was screaming daily because she had no hot water for her lavish baths. Desperate to save his crumbling public image, Julian traveled urgently to the royal capital. He tried to borrow money from his wealthy, influential aristocratic friends. Every single noble lord politely but firmly shut their heavy doors in his face. They all knew the dukedom was secretly drowning in massive, unpayable debt. With absolutely no other options, Julian walked into the lobby of the Continental Trust. He aggressively demanded an emergency audience with the legendary chairman of the board. He was forced to wait for 3 humiliating hours in a cold, marble waiting room. When he was finally allowed into the grand corner office, he did not even look up. "I require a substantial loan to temporarily float my estate," Julian announced arrogantly. He pushed his highly exaggerated financial documents across the polished mahogany desk. I slowly picked up the forged papers with perfectly manicured hands. "Your credit is entirely worthless here, Duke Julian," I stated calmly into the quiet room. Julian violently jumped at the sound of my familiar voice. His eyes snapped up, and all the arrogant color drained completely from his face. He stared at the woman he had violently thrown into the freezing mud just days ago. I was wearing a tailored silk suit that cost more than his entire winter harvest. "Eleanor," he gasped, his voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered panic. "That is Madam Chairman to you," I corrected him with a sharp, cold smile. "And I am officially denying your pathetic application for financial rescue." He had come to the most powerful bank in the empire desperately begging for his life. He never expected his discarded wife to be the one holding the executioner's axe. Julian completely refused to accept his humiliating defeat in my grand office. He immediately hired the most ruthless aristocratic lawyers in the entire capital. He intended to use archaic marriage laws to forcefully seize my bank. He publicly claimed that I had illegally stolen his rightful family treasury. He threatened to drag my name through a scandalous, highly publicized court trial. He foolishly thought the threat of social ruin would force me to surrender my wealth. He drastically underestimated the raw power of the empire's new modern economy. I did not waste a single moment arguing with his greedy, desperate legal team. Instead, I publicly announced the Continental Trust's newest master project. I officially offered to fully finance the construction of the Grand National Railway. It was a massive infrastructure initiative that the king desperately needed for trade. The royal parliament had been praying for a wealthy investor for over a decade. My proposal instantly made me the most vital political figure in the country. When Julian's lawyers officially attempted to freeze my corporate assets, the government intervened. The Prime Minister himself signed an emergency decree protecting my absolute sovereignty. He legally nullified Julian's outdated aristocratic marriage claims within 24 hours. The royal court explicitly warned the Duke to never harass the empire's greatest benefactor again. Julian was completely stripped of his legal power and entirely politically isolated. His pathetic lawsuit was thrown out before it ever reached a judge. Meanwhile, the severe lack of funds at Stirling Manor was causing a critical emergency. Victoria was suffering from severe pregnancy complications brought on by extreme stress. She was confined to a freezing bedroom because they could not afford quality firewood. The local doctors demanded upfront payment in pure gold before treating her condition. Julian had absolutely nothing left in his empty vaults to offer them. He was finally realizing that a noble title meant absolutely nothing without the wealth to support it. And the woman he violently threw away now held every single gold coin in the realm. I sat comfortably in my warm, secure home, watching my daughters play happily. I was slowly suffocating the Stirling dukedom without ever lifting a single weapon. Victoria's agonizing cries echoed through the freezing, empty halls of Stirling Manor. The local doctors completely refused to step inside the estate without upfront gold. Julian was trapped in a desperate, suffocating nightmare of his own making. He made a highly shameful decision to blindly save his unborn male heir. He crept into Victoria's dark bedroom while she slept in a feverish sweat. He carefully stole the magnificent sapphire necklace right from her wooden dressing table. It was the exact priceless heirloom that legally belonged to my maternal family. Julian wrapped his face in a thick wool scarf and traveled anonymously to the capital. He entered the most exclusive underground auction house in the wealthy commercial district. He desperately hoped to sell my stolen legacy to an anonymous foreign buyer. He needed raw cash immediately to hire the expensive royal physicians. He had absolutely no idea who actually owned the grand, secretive auction house. I sat quietly in the dark, luxurious VIP balcony overlooking the main stage. The Continental Trust secretly controlled every major financial transaction in this city. I watched my pathetic former husband nervously hand over the glowing sapphires to the appraiser. The auctioneer placed my family's treasure directly under the bright spotlights. The wealthy crowd immediately gasped at the flawless, breathtaking blue stones. Before the fierce bidding could even begin, I firmly pressed a silver bell. The sharp, ringing sound instantly silenced the entire crowded room. I stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly to the very edge of the balcony. "That item is not legally available for purchase," I announced clearly. Julian looked up at the balcony, his eyes widening in pure, absolute terror. "That necklace is stolen property belonging entirely to the chairman of the Continental Trust." I casually dropped the original, signed deed of ownership down to the main floor. The auctioneer inspected the heavy parchment and immediately nodded to the security guards. For massive security officers instantly surrounded the ruined, trembling Duke. "Arrest that man for attempting to fence stolen corporate assets," I commanded coldly. They roughly grabbed Julian's arms and forced him to his knees on the hard floor. His thick scarf fell away, exposing his humiliated, panicked face to the elite crowd. He was no longer a proud, untouchable aristocrat demanding blind respect. He was just a desperate, pathetic thief caught stealing from a ruthless billionaire. He looked up at me with tears of absolute defeat streaming down his dirty face. "Eleanor, please, Victoria and my son are dying," he screamed hysterically in front of everyone. I looked down at the miserable man who had thrown my innocent daughters into the storm. "Her survival is absolutely none of my business," I replied without a single ounce of pity. Julian spent the night in a freezing, filthy holding cell beneath the city guardhouse. He was facing 20 years in the Royal Penitentiary for grand theft and corporate fraud. Early the next morning, my elite legal team visited his miserable cell with a thick stack of contracts. They offered him a single, ruthlessly calculated escape route from total annihilation. He had to legally transfer the entire Sterling estate and all its remaining assets to the Continental Trust. In exchange, I would permanently drop the criminal charges and provide a small, pathetic sum of cash. It was just barely enough to hire a mediocre provincial doctor for his dying mistress. Julian signed the documents with trembling hands, weeping bitterly as he surrendered his ancestral legacy. He recklessly traded centuries of proud aristocratic history for a handful of silver coins. He was officially a landless commoner, permanently stripped of every single privilege he once weaponized against me. Clutching the small pouch of money, he desperately hired a cheap horse and rode blindly through the night. He pushed the exhausted animal to the absolute brink to reach his former countryside estate. When he finally kicked open the heavy front doors of the manor, the silence was absolutely deafening. The grand foyer was entirely empty, completely stripped of all remaining valuables by fleeing servants. He rushed frantically up the grand marble staircase to the freezing master bedroom. He found Victoria lying perfectly still on the blood-soaked silk sheets. She was barely breathing, her face completely pale and hollowed out by pure agony. The local doctor had ultimately refused to intervene without prior payment. She had brutally miscarried the heavily anticipated male heir in the absolute freezing dark. The precious son that Julian had violently destroyed his marriage to secure was gone forever. He collapsed onto the dirty wooden floor, screaming in pure, unrestricted agony. His massive, cruel gamble had resulted in the total loss of absolutely everything he valued. Meanwhile, I sat comfortably in my warm corporate office in the royal capital. I steadily stamped my official corporate seal onto the pristine deed to his former home. I legally owned the very walls that had once trapped me in humiliating misery. The ruthless business of revenge was proving to be highly profitable. A full week passed before I decided to personally inspect my newly acquired countryside property. I hired a massive fleet of heavily guarded carriages to escort me back to Stirling Manor. I brought my 3 beautiful daughters with me to witness our ultimate, undeniable triumph. They wore the absolute finest imported winter coats, looking like true modern royalty. We arrived at the towering wrought iron gates just before the midday sun broke through the clouds. The exact same gates that had violently banished me into the storm were now securely locked open. My highly paid private security team had already secured the entire perimeter of the vast estate. I walked up the grand marble steps with my head held incredibly high. The heavy oak front doors were immediately pushed open by my own armed guards. Inside, the once glorious and intimidating manor was freezing, dark, and utterly depressing. Julian was sitting directly on the floor of the grand foyer, surrounded by dozens of empty wine bottles. He looked up at me with hollow, deeply bloodshot eyes that held absolutely no remaining life. Victoria was shivering violently under a thin, dirty blanket on a nearby velvet sofa. The highly arrogant woman who proudly stole my life was now nothing but a broken, terrified shell. "Why are you here, Eleanor?" Julian whispered, his voice cracking with dry, pathetic despair. "Are you simply here to cruelly gloat over the dead son you forced me to lose?" I stopped right in front of him, looking down at his unwashed, completely defeated face. "I did not force you to steal from my bank or criminally neglect your pregnant mistress, Julian. I am simply here to legally inspect the newest real estate asset in my expanding corporate portfolio." I snapped my fingers sharply, and my lead corporate attorney handed Julian a single piece of paper. "This is your official, legally binding eviction notice," I announced clearly into the quiet, dead room. "You have exactly 1 hour to vacate my private property completely." Julian stared at the legal document, his dirty hands trembling violently as he read the harsh words. "You cannot throw us out into the freezing cold," Victoria sobbed weakly from the ruined sofa. "We have absolutely no money left, no horses for travel, and nowhere else in the world to go." I turned to look directly at the woman who had openly mocked my crying daughters in the rain. "You threw my 3 innocent children into a brutal midnight storm without a single second of hesitation," I reminded her coldly. "You firmly believed that absolute, unapologetic cruelty was the exclusive privilege of the victorious. Now, you will intimately experience the exact same merciless standard you eagerly established." Julian desperately tried to reach out and grab the hem of my expensive tailored coat. My massive security guards instantly stepped forward and violently kicked his reaching hand away. "You have exactly 1 hour, I repeated, my voice as hard and unforgiving as solid steel. "Or my men will physically drag you both out and throw you into the mud outside the front gates." I turned my back on the ruined couple, completely unbothered by their sudden, hysterical weeping. My daughters were waiting for me in the warm, sunlit courtyard, completely safe and eternally protected. News of the ruthless Sterling eviction spread like absolute wildfire through the royal capital. I did not waste a single moment celebrating the miserable downfall of my former husband. My focus shifted entirely to securing a permanent, untouchable legacy for my 3 daughters. The Continental Trust successfully launched the Grand National Railway project months ahead of schedule. Thousands of new lucrative jobs were created, and the empire's economy experienced an unprecedented boom. The once despised, discarded wife was now universally hailed as the supreme architect of modern prosperity. I established a massive, heavily funded educational foundation exclusively for young women and abandoned children. I named the grand institution after my 3 beautiful daughters, ensuring their names permanently meant hope. The archaic, male-dominated aristocratic society was forced to completely bow to my overwhelming financial supremacy. My immense influence eventually reached the highest, most secretive chambers of the royal palace. On a crisp, bright Tuesday morning, the king's personal carriage arrived at my fortified townhouse. Crown Prince Edward stepped out, completely surrounded by the heavily armed elite royal guard. He was the most eligible, powerful, and widely respected young man in the entire kingdom. He did not arrogantly summon me to the grand palace like a subordinate or a common merchant. He traveled directly to my front door to show absolute, undeniable respect to my superior position. My private security guards escorted the future king directly into my magnificent, sunlit drawing room. Edward bowed deeply, treating me not as a loyal subject, but as an absolute sovereign equal. "Madam Chairman, you have practically saved my father's dying kingdom from complete financial ruin," he began smoothly. "The Royal Council is deeply terrified of your immense power, but I am simply in absolute awe. He sat across from me, his dark eyes filled with genuine, unfiltered, and highly intelligent admiration. I am not here to offer you a meaningless aristocratic title or demand your blind submission. I am here to formally ask for a permanent, equal partnership in ruling this rapidly changing era. He gracefully dropped to one knee right in front of my expensive mahogany desk. I want you to stand beside the throne, not behind it, as my legally wedded wife. He offered the ultimate peak of societal power to a woman who was recently thrown into the freezing mud. Julian had violently discarded me solely because he believed a woman's only value was producing male heirs. Now, the brilliant future ruler of the entire empire was desperately begging me to share his ultimate crown. I looked at the incredibly handsome, intelligent prince willingly offering me half the known world. I smiled softly, fully knowing I already owned the absolute financial foundation he stood upon. The magnificent royal drawing room was completely silent as Crown Prince Edward waited patiently for my final answer. He was officially offering me the absolute highest political position in the entire civilized world. Just a few short months ago, I was violently thrown into the freezing mud for failing to produce a male heir. Julian had cruelly stripped me of my home, my basic dignity, and my aristocratic title. Now, the future ruler of the vast empire was kneeling on my expensive Persian rug, begging to share his throne. I looked down at the heavy gold rings on my fingers, the ultimate symbols of the massive corporate empire I had built from scratch. I looked at my 3 beautiful daughters, who were currently reading happily in the adjacent sunroom. They were the absolute greatest achievements of my entire life, not the bitter disappointments Julian constantly claimed they were. I am deeply honored by your sincere proposal, Your Highness, I finally said, my voice incredibly steady and calm. But I will never surrender the absolute control of the Continental Trust to the royal crown. If I agree to marry you, my daughters will remain the sole legal heirs to my massive financial empire. I will not walk a single step behind you, nor will I quietly obey your outdated, suffocating royal traditions. I will not become a silent, smiling decoration for the royal court to parade around during state dinners. I am the supreme architect of my own destiny, and I completely refuse to be a mere shadow to any king. Crown Prince Edward did not look angry, insulted, or hesitant in the slightest. Instead, a brilliant, genuine smile of absolute relief spread across his handsome face. I do not want a submissive, silent shadow, Eleanor, he replied with profound respect. I desperately need a brilliant, ruthless, and visionary equal to help me govern this rapidly changing modern world. The old aristocratic ways are rotting this nation from the inside out. With your incredible financial mind and my political authority, we can build a completely new era of prosperity. Your strict terms are absolutely accepted, today and for the rest of our natural lives. He gently took my hand and kissed it, officially sealing the most powerful political and financial alliance in history. As the massive royal trumpets sounded outside my window to announce our union, my thoughts drifted briefly to the gutters of the city. In the darkest, most dangerous slum of the royal capital, Julian was currently fighting a losing battle for his miserable life. He was dressed in filthy, rotting rags, his former aristocratic features completely hidden by grime and severe disease. He was desperately begging for dirty copper coins in the freezing rain just to buy a piece of stale bread. Victoria lay shivering uncontrollably in a damp, rat-infested alleyway just a few feet behind him. She was completely broken, coughing up dark blood from a severe infection she caught after her brutal, unassisted miscarriage. She constantly screamed at Julian, viciously cursing him for dragging her into this inescapable hell. Their so-called passionate love had completely rotted into violent, toxic hatred. They blamed each other for their total ruin, spending their final days screaming in the freezing mud. Suddenly, the massive bronze bells of the central cathedral began to ring in a joyous, deafening chorus. A grand royal parade was marching directly through the main avenues of the capital city to publicly announce our engagement. Julian dragged his weak, freezing body toward the main street to see the massive public commotion. He pushed through the filthy crowds of beggars, his hollow eyes searching for the source of the loud music. He watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as an extravagant golden carriage rolled slowly past the cheering citizens. I was sitting inside that magnificent carriage, wearing a breathtaking gown woven with pure gold thread. Crown Prince Edward sat proudly beside me, holding my hand for the entire world to clearly witness. Julian stared at the radiant, untouchable woman he had foolishly discarded like worthless garbage. He then saw my 3 beautiful daughters riding right behind me in their own luxurious, heavily guarded carriage. They were healthy, brilliantly educated, incredibly wealthy, and universally adored by the entire nation. Hazel waved gracefully to the crowd, her future completely secured by a massive trust fund. Ivy sat tall and confident, already learning how to manage the vast estates she would soon inherit. Lily smiled brightly, completely unaware of the miserable man watching them from the dirty gutter. Julian realized in that exact agonizing moment that he had thrown away the absolute greatest treasures in the universe. He had brutally destroyed his own life, his ancestral legacy, and his entire future just to chase a non-existent boy. The sheer, crushing weight of his monumental regret finally broke his weak, pathetic heart. He collapsed face first into the freezing mud of the gutter, weeping hysterically as the royal parade left him behind forever. His dying breaths were filled with the vivid, painful memory of the warm hearth he had violently destroyed. He died completely anonymously in the dirt, entirely erased from the glorious history I was currently writing. Back in the golden carriage, I did not even glance toward the filthy, crowded alleyways. I was entirely focused on the bright, endless horizon stretching out beautifully before me. The terrified, weeping wife who left Stirling Manor in the dark rain was completely dead and gone. She had been successfully replaced by an unstoppable queen of modern industry and absolute sovereign power. The cruel, outdated laws of arrogant men could never dictate the true value of my existence ever again. My daughters would grow up in a modern world where their brilliant minds were valued far above their gender. We had survived the absolute worst storm imaginable and emerged as the undisputed masters of the empire. I pulled my girls close to me, feeling the wonderful warmth of the sun shining brightly on our faces. The heavy, suffocating iron gates of my miserable past were permanently sealed shut. And our truly glorious, untouchable reign was only just beginning.